My knees gave out before I even realized I was falling. 1 second I was gripping the edge of the hallway table, and the next, the marble floor was rushing up to meet me. I heard the crash of a vase before I felt the pain, glass scattering across the tiles like tiny stars. Then everything went dark and quiet, and the last thing I remember was the sound of fast footsteps coming toward me down the long corridor of the Ricci estate. My name is Nora Bellamy, and I have worked as a housekeeper for Damon Ricci for almost a year. Everyone in this city knows his name, and everyone lowers their voice when they say it. He runs one of the most powerful families in the region, a man who commands respect with a single look, a man whose enemies disappear as quietly as smoke. But to me, for the past year, he has mostly been a closed door at the end of a hallway, and a man who leaves half-eaten meals on his desk because he forgets to stop working. I took this job because my mother got sick 8 months ago, and the medical bills started eating through every paycheck I had. The pay at the Ricci estate was more than double what I made at my old cleaning job, and I told myself I could handle the long hours. I told myself I could handle anything if it meant keeping my mother in her small apartment with her medicine and her warm blankets, instead of somewhere colder and less kind. What I did not tell myself was how much it would cost me physically. 16-hour days had become normal. I would finish cleaning the East Wing, move to the kitchen to help prepare meals, then spend the evening organizing files in the study because the last assistant quit without warning. I barely slept. I barely ate. I told myself I was strong enough for it, that a woman my size could handle physical work better than anyone doubted. I proved that every single day. But strength has limits, and mine had quietly been running out for weeks. That night, I had been on my feet since 5 in the morning. There had been a tense meeting in Damon's study earlier. Men in dark suits speaking in low, clipped voices, doors closing harder than usual. I did not ask questions. I never asked questions. I simply waited until the men left, then went in to clean the room, gathering empty glasses and straightening chairs that had been pushed back in anger. I remember bending down to pick up a folder that had fallen near the desk, and the room tilting sideways as if the floor itself had shifted. My vision blurred at the edges. My ears started ringing. I told myself to keep moving, that I only had a few more tasks left before I could finally sit down, but my body had already decided otherwise. I do not know how long I was on the floor before he found me. What I do know is that the first thing I felt when awareness came creeping back was warmth. Strong arms lifting me like I weighed nothing at all, though I know for a fact that I do not. I have spent years hearing comments about my size, about how a plus-size woman like me must be difficult to carry, must be heavy, must be a burden in one way or another. But in that moment, being lifted from the cold marble floor, none of that mattered. I only felt safe. I forced my eyes open for just a moment, and saw his face close to mine, jaw tight with something that looked almost like fear, though I told myself later that I must have imagined it. Men like Damon Ricci do not feel fear, not for anyone, and certainly not for their housekeeper. "Stay with me," he said, his voice low and rough, nothing like the cold, controlled tone he used with his men. "Do not close your eyes again." I tried to answer him, but my body refused to cooperate, and the darkness pulled me back under before I could get a single word out. When I woke again, the room around me was unfamiliar in a way that made my heart skip. Soft golden lamplight, heavy curtains pulled halfway closed, sheets far too fine for someone like me to be lying in. For one terrifying second, I thought I had done something wrong, that I had trespassed somewhere I was never supposed to be. Then the memory of collapsing in the hallway came rushing back, and my stomach twisted with embarrassment. I tried to sit up, and that was when I noticed it. My hand was wrapped tightly around another hand. His hand. Damon Ricci was sitting in a chair pulled close to the bed, his head tilted slightly to the side, as if he had drifted off despite himself, his fingers laced through mine like it was the most natural thing in the world. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at our joined hands for a long moment, unsure if I was still dreaming, unsure if exhaustion had finally broken something in my mind. I tried to gently pull my hand back, not wanting to wake him, not wanting to make this moment more complicated than it already was. But the second I moved, his eyes opened, sharp and alert in an instant, the way I imagined a man in his position had trained himself to wake, ready for danger even in his sleep. His gaze found mine, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. The air between us felt heavy, charged with something I could not name, and was too afraid to try naming. "You're awake," he said finally, releasing my hand, as if he had only just realized he was holding it. He stood up quickly, putting distance between us, running a hand through his dark hair. "You collapsed. Do you remember?" I nodded slowly, my cheeks burning with humiliation. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened. I must have just... I'm fine now, really. I should get back to work. There's still..." "You are not fine," he cut in, his voice sharp enough to stop me mid-sentence. "You have not slept properly in weeks. I have watched you push yourself past exhaustion nearly every single day, and tonight, your body finally forced you to stop. You will not be going back to work tonight." I opened my mouth to argue, because arguing was easier than admitting how right he was, but something in his expression told me this was not a conversation I was going to win. "Why did you carry me yourself?" I asked instead, the question slipping out before I could stop it. "You could have called someone, one of the staff, or... I was the one who found you," he said simply, as if that answered everything. But there was something in the way he avoided my eyes when he said it, something that told me the truth was more complicated than simple proximity. A silence stretched between us, thick and uncertain. I studied his face in the lamplight, the sharp lines of his jaw, the tired shadows under his eyes that I had never noticed before, because he never let anyone close enough to see them. For the first time since I started working in this house, he did not look like the feared boss everyone whispered about. He looked like a man who had not slept properly either, a man carrying weight that had nothing to do with business meetings and everything to do with something deeper. "Rest," he said finally, his voice softer now, though still edged with that same commanding tone he could not seem to fully let go of. "That is an order, not a request. I will have food brought up to you, you will eat, and then you will sleep, and tomorrow, you will not lift a single object heavier than a spoon." I wanted to protest, to remind him that I could not afford to lose a day of pay, that my mother's medicine would not buy itself, but the exhaustion sitting heavy in my bones convinced me to stay quiet, at least for tonight. He walked toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame, glancing back at me one last time. "Nora," he said, and hearing my name in his voice sent an unexpected shiver down my spine. It was the first time he had ever used it. Up until now, I had simply been the housekeeper, or, on rare occasions, you there. "Yes?" I whispered. "Do not scare me like that again." He left before I could respond, the door closing softly behind him, leaving me alone in a room that smelled faintly of him, staring at the space where he had just been sitting, my hand still tingling from the warmth of his. I lay back against the pillows, my mind racing despite my exhaustion. I told myself it meant nothing. Men in his position had reputations to protect, and a housekeeper collapsing on his floor was simply a liability he needed to manage quickly and quietly. That was all this was. Practical concern, nothing more. But then I remembered the way his hand had felt wrapped around mine, steady and warm, and the way his voice had cracked slightly when he told me to stay with him. Practical men do not hold hands with unconscious housekeepers for hours while they sleep in an uncomfortable chair. Practical men do not look at someone the way he had looked at me when I opened my eyes. I told myself I was imagining things, reading too much into a moment born from stress and fear. I was, after all, only his employee. A woman he paid to clean his home and manage his schedule. Nothing more. Men like Damon Ricci did not fall for women like me, plus size and plain, women who scrubbed floors and folded his laundry. That kind of story only existed in the movies I used to watch with my mother before she got sick, back when we still had time for such simple pleasures. And yet, as sleep finally began pulling me under again, I could not stop thinking about the warmth of his hand, or the strange, unfamiliar softness in his eyes when he told me not to scare him again. Something had shifted that night, something I could not quite name yet, but something I knew, deep in my bones, was not going to be easy to ignore. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the curtains and the smell of fresh coffee and warm bread drifting into the room. A tray sat on the small table beside the bed, still steaming, arranged with more care than I expected from anyone in that household. I stared at it for a long moment, before allowing myself to believe it was real. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet, savoring a morning where I did not have to rush from one task to the next. Guilt gnawed at me the entire time, the nagging feeling that I should be up, that I should be working, that people like me did not get mornings like this. But beneath the guilt was something else too, something warmer, something that felt dangerously close to hope. When I finally made my way downstairs, dressed and steady on my feet again, the staff greeted me with wide eyes and whispered questions I pretended not to hear. Word had clearly already spread through the house about what happened, about how the boss himself had carried me to his private wing instead of the staff quarters, about how he had stayed by my side through the night. I kept my head down and focused on my work, telling myself that whatever had happened between us was a private moment, born from a stressful night, nothing more. But every time I passed his study and caught a glimpse of him through the open door, I felt that same charged awareness settle over me, and I knew, with a sinking, thrilling certainty, that things between Damon Ricci and me were never going to be quite the same again. By the third day, the whispers among the staff had not slowed down at all. I caught Della, one of the older housekeepers who had worked for the Ricci family for nearly a decade, watching me with a curious smile every time I walked past her in the hallway. She was the closest thing I had to a friend in that enormous house, and she finally cornered me in the laundry room while I was folding towels, her arms crossed and her eyebrows raised. "You know everyone is talking about you," she said, keeping her voice low even though we were alone. "I wish they would stop," I muttered, focusing hard on the towel in my hands, refusing to meet her eyes. "He carried you to his own bed, Nora. He sat with you all night. Men like him do not do that for staff. I have worked here 9 years, and I have never once seen him show that kind of concern for anyone, not even his own men." "He was being responsible," I said, though even to my own ears the excuse sounded thin. "I collapsed on his property. He probably just did not want the liability." Della laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "Liability does not hold your hand for hours while you sleep, sweetheart. I heard from the guard outside the door that he never once left your side, not even to answer his phone, and that man never lets his phone go unanswered. Not for anyone. I did not have an answer for that, so I simply kept folding towels, my mind spinning with questions I was too afraid to ask out loud. Over the following days, small things began to change. Subtle at first, easy to dismiss if I tried hard enough. Meals started appearing outside my room, in the staff quarters at strange hours. Always something warm, always more than I could possibly finish alone. My schedule, which used to stretch impossibly long into the night, suddenly had built-in breaks that no one had ever bothered giving me before. When I asked the head of staff about it, she simply shrugged and said the instructions had come directly from Damon himself, no explanation given. I told myself it was guilt. That was the story I kept repeating in my head, over and over, because it was easier to believe than the alternative. A powerful man like him would naturally feel responsible if an employee collapsed under the weight of an unreasonable workload. It made sense that he would want to correct that, to protect himself from any further incidents. It had nothing to do with me specifically. It could not. And yet, one evening, nearly a week after the collapse, I was carrying a stack of folders toward his study when I nearly walked straight into him coming the other direction. The folders scattered across the floor, papers sliding everywhere, and I dropped to my knees immediately to gather them, apologizing rapidly, my face burning with embarrassment. "Leave it," he said, crouching down across from me, gathering papers alongside me instead of simply standing there and watching me clean up my own mess, the way I had expected. "You don't have to do that," I said quickly, reaching for the same folder he had just picked up, our fingers brushing for a brief moment that sent an unwelcome jolt straight up my arm. He paused, looking at me directly, closer now than we had been since that night in his bedroom. This close, I could see small details I had never noticed before, a faint scar near his temple, the way his dark eyes held flecks of something lighter when the hallway light caught them just right. "Why do you never take breaks?" he asked suddenly, his voice quieter than his usual commanding tone. The question caught me off guard. "I have a lot of work to do." "That is not an answer." I hesitated. unsure how much to reveal, unsure if sharing anything personal with a man like him was wise. But something about the directness in his gaze made it difficult to lie. My mother is sick. I need this job, and I need to be good at it, so I do not have a lot of room to slow down. Something shifted behind his eyes, something that looked almost like understanding, though I could not imagine what a man of his wealth and power could possibly understand about the kind of desperation that kept me working 16-hour days. "What is wrong with her?" he asked, and the question sounded genuine, not simply polite. "Her heart," I said quietly. "She needs medication that is not cheap, and the doctors say she may need surgery eventually. I am the only one who can pay for it." He was quiet for a long moment, still crouched there on the floor with me, folders forgotten between us. "You should have told someone sooner, about your hours, about needing more support." "You are not exactly an easy man to approach with personal problems," I said, before I could stop myself, immediately regretting the boldness of the comment. To my surprise, the corner of his mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, but close. "No," he agreed, "I suppose I am not." We finished gathering the papers in silence after that, and when he stood, he offered his hand to help me up, a small gesture that should not have meant anything but somehow felt enormous. I took it, letting him pull me to my feet, very aware of how easily his fingers wrapped around mine, the same way they had that first night. "Thank you," I said softly, unsure exactly what I was thanking him for. He nodded once, then turned and walked toward his study without another word, leaving me standing in the hallway with my heart pounding harder than it had any right to. The peace of those small, quiet moments did not last long. 3 days later, the atmosphere in the house shifted entirely. I noticed it first in the way the guards at the front gate stood straighter, more alert, their eyes constantly scanning the long driveway. Damon's men began arriving in greater numbers than usual, their expressions tense, their voices low and clipped whenever they passed through the halls. I was in the kitchen helping prepare dinner when Della grabbed my arm, her face pale. "There's trouble," she whispered. "A rival family, the Callaways. They have been pushing into territory that belongs to the Ricci's, and tonight, there is a meeting happening here, a dangerous one. Boss wants all staff to stay in the East Wing until it's over." My stomach twisted with unease. I had heard whispers about the Callaway family before, always in hushed tones, always accompanied by nervous glances toward the doors, as if simply saying the name too loudly might summon trouble. I did as I was told, retreating to the East Wing, along with the rest of the staff, but curiosity and worry kept pulling me toward the windows that overlooked the front courtyard. I watched as several black cars pulled up the driveway, men in dark suits stepping out, their postures rigid with barely restrained hostility. Damon walked out to meet them himself, flanked by 2 of his most trusted men, his expression carved from stone, utterly unreadable. I had never seen him look so cold, so distant from the man who had crouched beside me in the hallway just days earlier, gently asking about my mother's health. The conversation outside was too far away for me to hear clearly, but the tension was visible even from a distance. Sharp gestures, raised voices that dropped just as quickly, hands hovering near jackets in a way that made my heart race with fear. I gripped the curtain tightly, unable to look away, terrified something terrible was about to happen right in front of me. Then, without warning, one of the Callaway men stepped forward aggressively, and Damon's entire posture changed in an instant, shifting from controlled tension into something far more dangerous. I saw him say something short and sharp, and the man immediately backed down, though the hostility in the air did not fade even slightly. I do not know how long the standoff lasted, but eventually the Callaway men returned to their cars and drove away, leaving a heavy silence hanging over the estate. My hands were shaking by the time Damon walked back inside, and though I tried to slip away before he noticed me watching, he caught my eye across the room. He crossed the space between us in a few long strides, his expression softening slightly, though the tension from outside had not fully left his shoulders. "You should not have been watching that," he said quietly. "I was worried," I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise maybe, or something warmer that I did not dare try to name. "You do not need to worry about me. I think I do anyway," I said, and the moment I said it, I realized how true it was. Somewhere between that first night and this one, I had started caring about what happened to this man. This powerful, dangerous man, who was supposed to be nothing more than my employer. He studied me for a long moment, something unspoken passing between us, heavy and uncertain. It is not safe for you to be around me. You understand that, don't you? I understand, I said softly, though understanding and accepting were two very different things. Good, he said, though his voice lacked the conviction I expected. He reached out, briefly, as if to touch my arm, then seemed to catch himself and pulled back before making contact. Get some rest. Tonight is over. Tomorrow will be calmer. He walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there in the dim hallway, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something far more dangerous, something that felt disturbingly close to falling. 2 days after the standoff with the Calloway men, Damon called me into his study for what he described only as a discussion about the household budget, though the moment I stepped inside, I could tell that was not the real reason at all. He sat behind his desk, a folder open in front of him, but his eyes were fixed on me rather than the papers. Sit down, Nora, he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. I sat carefully, unsure what to expect. Is something wrong? I have been thinking about your hours, he said. About the arrangement we have. I want to increase your pay, and I want to hire additional staff so the workload is distributed more fairly. I blinked, caught off guard by the sudden practicality of the conversation after everything that had happened between us in recent days. You do not have to do that. I know I do not have to, he said. I want to. You have been carrying far too much for far too long, and it took you collapsing on my floor for me to notice how badly I had failed to see it sooner. You did not fail, I said gently. I never told anyone how hard things had gotten. I was too proud, or too afraid, to admit I needed help. Pride can be a dangerous thing, he said, a small, knowing smile touching his lips. I would know. I have built an entire life around refusing to admit weakness of any kind. Is that what this is? I asked, curious despite myself. Weakness? Caring about someone? He considered the question seriously, leaning back in his chair. I used to believe that. My father taught me that attachment made a man vulnerable, that anyone who mattered to you became a target the moment your enemies discovered it. For years, I avoided anything that resembled real closeness, convinced it was the only way to keep the people around me safe. And now? I pressed gently. Now I am beginning to think that isolating myself never protected anyone, he admitted. It only made me lonelier, and it did nothing to stop the losses I was so afraid of in the first place. I did not know what to say to that, so instead, I simply reached across the desk and placed my hand over his, a small gesture that seemed to mean more in that quiet study than any words could have expressed. He turned his hand over beneath mine, lacing our fingers together, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke, the comfortable silence saying everything that needed to be said. From that day forward, the household staff noticed a subtle shift in how things operated. 2 new housekeepers were hired within the week, easing the burden that had rested almost entirely on my shoulders for months. My hours shortened considerably, and for the first time since I had started working at the estate, I found myself with actual free evenings. Hours I no longer knew quite what to do with after so long spent in constant motion. I told myself, as I made my way back to my room that night, that caring about a man like Damon Ricci was the most reckless thing I could possibly do. His world was violent and unpredictable, filled with enemies who would not hesitate to use anyone close to him as a weapon. I had a mother depending on me, a fragile stability I could not afford to risk on feelings I barely understood. But as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the concern in his eyes when he told me not to worry about him, I already knew, with a sinking certainty, that it was far too late to protect my heart from the danger it was already walking toward. In the weeks that followed, something quietly began to change between us, so gradually that I almost did not notice it happening until I was already deep inside it. Damon started staying up later than usual, and more often than not, I would find him in the study long after the rest of the house had gone dark, a glass of untouched whiskey sitting beside stacks of papers he was not really reading. The first night I found him like that, I almost turned around and left, not wanting to intrude on whatever heavy thoughts kept him awake, but he looked up before I could slip away, and something in his expression, tired and unguarded in a way I had never seen before, made me stay. "You should be asleep," he said, though there was no real command behind the words this time. "So should you," I answered, stepping further into the room, despite every instinct telling me to keep my distance. He let out a short, humorless laugh and gestured toward the chair across from his desk. I hesitated only a moment before sitting down, the silence between us surprisingly comfortable rather than awkward. "Do you ever get tired of it?" I asked quietly, watching the tension carved into every line of his face. All of this, the meetings, the danger, the constant watching over your shoulder. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought he might not answer at all. "Every single day," he finally admitted. "But it is not something I get to walk away from. This life chose me before I ever had the chance to choose anything for myself." "What do you mean?" "My father built this empire," he said, his voice low and distant, as if he were speaking more to himself than to me. "I was groomed for this role since I was a child. There was never a question of whether I would take over one day, only when." "That sounds lonely," I said softly, and something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, that someone had noticed something so simple, yet so rarely acknowledged. "It is," he admitted. "Everyone around me wants something. Loyalty bought with fear, respect earned through violence. I did not always choose. I have not had a real conversation with someone who was not trying to gain something from me in longer than I can remember." "I am not trying to gain anything from you," I said, meeting his eyes steadily. "I know," he said, and the simple certainty in his voice made my chest tighten with something warm and unfamiliar. "That is exactly why I find myself telling you things I have never told anyone else." We talked for hours that night, longer than I had ever spoken with him before, longer than I had spoken with almost anyone and longer than I could remember. He told me about his mother, who had died when he was young, and how his father had grown colder and harder in the years that followed, teaching him that softness was a weakness he could not afford. He told me about a younger brother he had lost to a rival family's ambush years ago, a loss that still haunted the edges of his eyes whenever the subject came too close to the surface. In turn, I found myself sharing pieces of my own life I rarely spoke about with anyone. I told him about my father leaving when I was 12, about growing up watching my mother work 2 jobs just to keep us afloat, about the years of quiet cruelty from people who thought my size gave them permission to comment, to judge, to dismiss me before they even knew my name. "They were wrong," he said simply, when I finished telling him about a particularly painful memory from my early 20s, a job interview where the manager had openly told me I did not fit the image they wanted for their storefront. "Wrong about what?" "About what makes someone valuable," he said, his eyes steady on mine, sincere in a way that made it impossible to look away. "I have met countless people in my life who were thin and beautiful by every conventional standard, and every single one of them was hollow inside, interested only in what they could take. You walked into my collapsing world exhausted and overworked, and the first thing you did when you woke up was apologize and try to get back to your duties. That tells me everything I need to know about your character, and none of it has anything to do with your size." I did not know how to respond to that, my throat suddenly tight with emotion I was not prepared to feel. No one had ever spoken to me that way before, with such quiet, unwavering certainty, as if my worth was simply a fact rather than something up for debate. "Thank you," I whispered, and he reached across the desk, briefly covering my hand with his own, the same warmth I remembered from that first night settling over me instantly. A few nights later, I found myself walking through the estate's private garden, after finishing my duties, needing air and space to think through the tangled feelings that had settled over me since our conversation in the study. I did not expect to find Damon already there, sitting on a stone bench near the fountain, his jacket discarded beside him, looking more relaxed than I had ever seen him. "Trouble sleeping?" I asked, approaching slowly. "Something like that," he said, shifting slightly to make room beside him. I hesitated only a moment before joining him, the cool night air settling comfortably around us. "This garden was my mother's favorite place," he said quietly, his gaze drifting toward the carefully tended flower beds barely visible in the moonlight. "She used to bring me out here when I was young, Before she got sick, she would tell me stories about a life that had nothing to do with business or power, just simple things, trips she wanted to take, gardens she wanted to plant. What happened to her? I asked softly, though part of me already suspected the answer would be painful. Illness, he said, slow and cruel. My father did everything in his power to save her, spent fortunes on treatments that ultimately did nothing. I think that failure changed him more than anything else in his life. He became harder after that, colder, as if refusing to feel anything at all was the only way to protect himself from ever hurting like that again. And you learned that from him, I said, understanding settling over me. I tried to, he admitted. For years, I believed I had succeeded. But then you collapsed in that hallway, and something in me refused to stay distant the way I had trained myself to be with everyone else. I studied his profile in the moonlight, struck by how different he looked in this quiet, unguarded moment compared to the controlled, commanding figure I had first met nearly a year ago. I am sorry about your mother, I said gently, and about your brother. You have lost so much. I have, he agreed. But sitting here with you tonight, I find myself thinking less about what I have lost and more about what I might still have the chance to gain. The weight of his words settled over me, warm and terrifying all at once. I did not respond right away, simply allowing the silence to stretch between us, comfortable despite the intensity of the moment. From that night forward, our late-night conversations became a quiet, unspoken routine. I would finish my duties, and instead of retreating immediately to my room, I would find myself drawn toward his study, and he, in turn, seemed to be waiting for me more often than not. 2 cups of tea already prepared on the small table near the window, instead of just his usual whiskey. We never spoke about what was happening between us, both of us seeming to understand instinctively that naming it would somehow make it too real, too dangerous to ignore. But the space between us grew smaller with each passing night, our conversations lasting longer, our silences growing more comfortable, until one evening, sitting close together on the small couch near the fireplace, I realized just how little distance remained between our faces. "This is not wise," he murmured, though he made no move to pull away. "I know," I whispered back, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain he could hear it. "You deserve someone who can offer you safety. A normal life, not this. Not constant danger and enemies, who would use you against me without a second thought." "Maybe I do not want normal," I said quietly, surprising myself with the honesty of the admission. "Maybe I have spent my whole life being told what I deserve by people who never bothered to actually know me." His eyes searched mine for a long moment, something fierce and uncertain warring behind them. Slowly, achingly slowly, he leaned closer, and I found myself leaning in to meet him, every nerve in my body electric with anticipation. We were close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my lips, when a sharp knock at the study door shattered the moment entirely. We separated instantly, both of us straightening, as if we had been caught doing something forbidden, which, in a way, I suppose we had. Victor, one of Damon's most trusted lieutenants, stepped inside, his expression grim, immediately sensing the tension in the room, but wisely choosing not to comment on it. "We have a problem," Victor said, his eyes flicking briefly toward me, before settling back on Damon. "The Callaways are making moves. We just got word they know about her." My stomach dropped instantly. "Know about me?" Victor hesitated, glancing at Damon as if seeking permission to continue. Damon nodded once, his expression hardening back into the cold, controlled mask I had seen him wear the night the Callaway men came to the estate. "They know you spend significant time near the boss," Victor said carefully. "In our world, that makes you a target, a way to get leverage." The color must have drained from my face, because Damon immediately moved closer, his hand finding mine, steady and reassuring despite the alarm clearly written across his own features. "Nothing is going to happen to you," he said firmly, though the words felt more like a promise he was making to himself, as much as to me. "How did they find out?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly, despite my effort to remain calm. "It does not matter how," Victor said grimly. "What matters is what we do next. We need to increase security around her immediately, and we should consider relocating her somewhere safer, until this situation is resolved." "No," I said, surprising even myself with the firmness of my refusal. My mother needs me. I cannot just disappear. Nora, Damon said quietly, turning to face me fully, his expression torn between concern and something deeper, something that looked almost like fear for the first time since I had known him. This is not a request. If the Callaways believe they can use you to hurt me, they will not hesitate to try. Then let me help protect myself instead of hiding, I said, meeting his eyes steadily, despite the fear curling through my chest. I am not going to run from a life I have only just started to want. Something in his expression softened, though the worry did not fully leave his eyes. Victor cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable witnessing the private moment unfolding between us, and excused himself from the room, though not before promising to arrange for additional security immediately. Once we were alone again, Damon pulled me gently into his arms, an embrace that felt entirely different from anything we had shared before, protective and desperate all at once. I cannot lose someone else, he murmured into my hair, his voice breaking slightly, in a way that told me exactly how much the loss of his brother still weighed on him. Not because of this life I did not choose but cannot escape. You will not lose me, I whispered, though even as I said it, a small, terrified part of me wondered if I was making a promise I could not actually keep. We stood there together for a long time, wrapped in an embrace that felt like both a beginning and a warning, the fragile peace we had built over the past several weeks, now shadowed by a danger that had suddenly become terrifyingly real. Later that night, lying awake in my room, long after I should have fallen asleep, I found myself replaying every moment of the evening, the almost kiss, the fear in Victor's voice, the desperate way Damon had held me, as if trying to memorize the feeling before it could be taken away. I understood, with a clarity that settled deep in my bones, that whatever was growing between us had already moved past the point of simple attraction or curiosity. I was falling for a man whose world was built on danger and violence, a man whose enemies now knew my name and my face, a man who had just promised, with more desperation than certainty, that he would not let anything happen to me. I closed my eyes that night, uncertain of what the coming days would bring, but certain of one thing above all else. There was no version of my life anymore that did not include Damon Ricci, no matter how dangerous that truth had suddenly become. The following days passed in a strange, tense rhythm. Extra guards appeared around the estate, patrolling the grounds at all hours, their presence a constant reminder of the danger hanging over us. Damon grew quieter, more focused, spending long hours locked in meetings with Victor and his other lieutenants, mapping out plans I was never fully told about. I understood he was trying to protect me by keeping me at a distance from the details, but the not knowing only made the fear worse. I insisted on continuing my regular visits to check on my mother twice a week, refusing to let fear completely dismantle the small life I had built outside the estate walls. Damon argued against it at first, but eventually agreed to let me go, on the condition that 2 of his men accompanied me every single time, watching from a careful distance to avoid alarming my mother, who knew nothing about the danger surrounding my employer. It was on one of these visits, nearly 2 weeks after Victor's warning, that everything came apart. I had just left my mother's apartment, waving goodbye to her from the doorway, promising to visit again soon, when I noticed the 2 guards who were supposed to be waiting near the car were nowhere in sight. My stomach tightened with unease as I scanned the quiet street, the late afternoon light casting long shadows between the buildings. Nora Bellamy. The voice came from behind me, calm and unfamiliar, and I turned to find a man I did not recognize standing far too close for comfort, flanked by 2 others who wore the same cold, calculated expressions I remembered from the Callaway men who had come to the estate weeks earlier. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound steady. "That does not matter," the man said, stepping closer. "What matters is that you are coming with us, quietly, and no one gets hurt. Not you, not your mother inside that apartment." Fear surged through me at the mention of my mother, sharp and immediate. I glanced back toward the building, terrified of what might happen if I refused, terrified of what might happen if I complied. "Do not make this difficult," the man continued, his tone almost gentle, which somehow made it more terrifying. "Ricci will come for you. That is exactly what we want." Before I could react, a hand closed around my arm, firm and unyielding, guiding me toward a dark car idling at the curb. I opened my mouth to scream, but a second man moved quickly, his hand pressing lightly but firmly over my mouth, cutting off any sound before it could escape. They forced me into the back seat, the door slamming shut, sealing me inside with two men who watched me with cold, disinterested eyes as the car pulled away from the curb, leaving my mother's building and the life I knew disappearing behind us. I do not know how long we drove, my mind spinning with fear and desperate attempts to memorize the turns, the landmarks, anything that might help later if I found a chance to escape or if help came looking for me. Eventually, we arrived at an old warehouse on the edge of the city, the kind of place I imagined only existed in the stories the staff sometimes whispered about late at night. They led me inside, securing my hands with rope tight enough to leave marks, seating me in a cold metal chair in the center of an otherwise empty room. The man who had first approached me outside my mother's apartment crouched in front of me, studying my face with an unsettling calm. "You should feel honored," he said quietly. "Ricci does not usually let anyone close enough to matter. You must be special." "Let me go," I said, forcing steel into my voice despite the fear churning inside me. "I have nothing to do with whatever conflict exists between your families." "That is where you are wrong," he said, standing and walking a slow circle around my chair. "You have everything to do with it now. You are the crack in his armor we have been searching for. He held your hand through the night after you collapsed. He canceled meetings to sit by your side. A man like Damon Ricci does not do that for someone who means nothing to him." I did not respond, refusing to give him the satisfaction of confirming what he already seemed to know. "He will come," the man continued confidently. "And when he does, we will finally have the leverage we need to end this conflict on our terms." At one point, the man left the room entirely, leaving me alone, with only the sound of distant voices echoing through the empty warehouse. I used the time to study my surroundings carefully, memorizing the position of the single door, the small window high on the far wall, the layout of the room, in case any opportunity for escape presented itself. My hands ached from the rope binding them, but I forced myself to stay calm, to breathe slowly, to keep my mind sharp instead of surrendering to the panic clawing at the edges of my thoughts. I thought about my mother, praying silently that she remained safe inside her apartment, unaware of the danger that had followed me out of her doorway. I thought about Della, about the quiet kindness she had shown me since the very first day I arrived at the estate, and I thought about Damon, about the warmth of his hand wrapped around mine that first night, about the vulnerability in his voice when he told me about his mother and brother, about the fierce protectiveness in his eyes every time danger came near me. I refused to believe this was how my story would end, taken from a quiet street and used as a pawn in a war I had never asked to be part of. I held on to that refusal like a lifeline, repeating it silently to myself, over and over, as the hours dragged on. Hours passed, each one stretching longer than the last, fear and exhaustion tangling together, until I could barely tell how much time had gone by. I thought about Damon constantly, wondering if he already knew I was missing, wondering what desperate lengths he might go to in order to find me, terrified of what danger he might walk into for my sake. Finally, I heard raised voices outside the room, followed by the unmistakable sound of a door being forced open with tremendous force. My heart leapt with a mixture of hope and terror as heavy footsteps approached, and moments later, the door to my room burst open. Damon stood in the doorway, his expression unlike anything I had ever seen on him before, a controlled fury so intense it seemed to fill the entire room with electric tension. Victor and several other men flanked him, weapons drawn, though Damon himself moved first, crossing the room in a few long strides and immediately working to free my bound hands, his fingers surprisingly gentle despite the violence radiating from every other part of him. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, his eyes scanning my face and body for any sign of injury, his voice tight with barely restrained emotion. "I'm okay," I managed, though my voice shook badly. "I'm okay, Damon." Relief flickered across his face for only a moment, before hardening back into something cold and dangerous, as he turned toward the man who had been questioning me, who now stood frozen near the far wall, clearly having underestimated how quickly Damon would locate us. "You made a serious mistake," Damon said, his voice deadly quiet in a way that sent a chill down my spine, a tone I had never heard him use before, one that made it abundantly clear exactly why people feared his name. I will not describe in detail everything that happened in the following minutes, only that the confrontation was swift, and that Damon's control over the situation left absolutely no doubt about the depth of the danger he was capable of when someone he cared about was threatened. The Calloway men who had taken me were dealt with decisively, their plan to use me as leverage crumbling entirely under the force of Damon's response. Once the immediate threat had been neutralized, Damon returned to my side, gently helping me to my feet, his hands trembling slightly despite his outward composure, a small crack in the controlled exterior he always presented to the world. "I am so sorry," he said, his voice raw with an emotion I had never heard from him before. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. This is exactly why I told you this life was too dangerous." "You saved me," I said softly, reaching up to touch his face gently, needing him to understand that I did not blame him for what had happened. "You found me. I should never have let you become a target in the first place," he said, his jaw tight with self-recrimination. "I should have kept my distance from the very beginning, protected you by staying away, instead of pulling you deeper into a world that nearly cost you your life today." "Stop," I said firmly, my own voice steadying, despite everything my body had just endured. "Do not you dare take this moment and use it to push me away. I am still here. I am still choosing this, choosing you, and nothing that happened today changes that." He looked at me with an expression of disbelief, mixed with something achingly tender, as if he could not quite comprehend how I could still want him after everything I had just been through because of my connection to him. "I have spent my entire life pushing everyone away," he admitted quietly, his hand coming up to rest against my cheek, warm and gentle despite the violence his hands had been capable of only minutes earlier, convincing myself that caring about someone only gave the world another way to hurt me. But that night I found you collapsed in the hallway. Something in me refused to let go. I have been fighting it ever since, telling myself it was too dangerous, too complicated, too much of a risk for both of us. "And now?" I asked softly, my heart pounding with anticipation despite the exhaustion weighing down every part of my body. "Now I understand that pushing you away was never going to protect either of us," he said, his voice steady and certain in a way I had not heard before. "Holding your hand that night was not an accident, Nora. It was me refusing to let go of the first person in years who made me feel like more than just a name people fear." Tears filled my eyes, exhaustion and relief, and something far deeper mixing together until I could barely speak. "I am not going anywhere," I whispered. He pulled me into his arms then, careful and gentle despite the strength I knew he possessed, holding me as if he never intended to let go again. Around us, Victor and the other men worked quickly to secure the warehouse and ensure our safe return to the estate. But for a long moment, none of that mattered. There was only the steady beat of his heart against my ear, and the quiet, overwhelming certainty that whatever came next, we would face it together. The drive back to the estate passed in a blur, Damon keeping my hand held tightly in his the entire way, occasionally glancing over as if reassuring himself that I was truly safe, truly still beside him. Neither of us spoke much, the events of the day too heavy and too raw for easy conversation, but the silence between us felt different now, filled with an understanding that did not require words. When we finally arrived back at the estate, exhaustion crashed over me all at once, the adrenaline that had kept me functioning throughout the ordeal, finally draining away, and leaving me barely able to stand. Damon noticed immediately, scooping me into his arms without hesitation, carrying me inside the way he had that very first night, though everything about this moment felt entirely different now, charged with an understanding and a closeness that had not existed before. "This is becoming a habit," I murmured weakly against his shoulder, managing a small, tired smile despite everything. "A habit I intend to keep for a very long time," he said quietly, pressing a soft kiss to the top of my head as he carried me up the stairs toward the room that, without either of us ever discussing it directly, had somehow become mine. I slept for nearly 14 hours after that night, my body finally allowing itself to rest now that the immediate danger had passed. When I woke, Sunlight was pouring through the curtains, and for a moment, I simply lay still, letting myself absorb the quiet safety of the room around me, grateful in a way I had never quite felt before, simply to be alive and unharmed. Damon was not in the room when I woke, but a note sat on the bedside table in handwriting that was surprisingly neat for a man whose life revolved around such rough business. He had gone to handle matters related to the Calloway family, the note explained, but he would return by evening, and he had left instructions for the staff to bring me anything I needed throughout the day. I spent the morning slowly, allowing myself the rare luxury of simply existing without a task list pressing down on me. Della checked on me twice, bringing tea and gentle conversation, careful not to ask too many questions about what had happened, though the concern in her eyes told me she already understood far more than she let on. "You look different," she said at one point, studying my face carefully as she refilled my cup. "Different how?" I asked. "Lighter," she said simply. "Like something you had been carrying for a long time finally got put down." I thought about her words for the rest of the day, turning them over in my mind as I moved slowly through the quiet estate, still healing from the exhaustion and fear of the day before. She was right, in a way I had not fully articulated to myself yet. For so long, I had carried the weight of believing I did not deserve real happiness, real love, simply because the world had spent years telling me my body, my size, my humble beginnings, made me less worthy of it than other people. But somewhere between that first night when Damon carried me to his bed and yesterday's terrifying ordeal, I had started to believe something entirely different. That evening, Damon returned, just as the sun began setting, painting the sky outside in deep shades of orange and gold. I was sitting on the small balcony attached to my room when I heard him approaching, and something in me settled immediately at the familiar sound of his footsteps. "How are you feeling?" he asked, joining me at the railing, his expression softer than I had seen it in the tense days leading up to my kidnapping. "Better," I said honestly, "stronger than I expected to feel." He nodded, though worry still lingered behind his eyes. "The situation with the Calloways has been resolved, permanently. They will not be a threat to you again." Relief washed through me, though I noticed the careful way he avoided elaborating on exactly what permanently resolved meant. And I decided, for now, that some details were better left unspoken between us. "I have been thinking," he continued, turning to face me fully, his expression suddenly more vulnerable than I had ever seen it. "About what happened, about what I said in that warehouse. About not wanting to let go?" I asked softly. "Yes," he said. "I meant every word of it, Nora, but I also understand that what I am asking of you is not simple. Loving me means accepting a life that will always carry risk, always carry danger. I cannot promise you a normal existence, no matter how much some part of me wishes I could offer you that instead." I considered his words carefully, understanding the weight and sincerity behind them. This was not a man making empty promises or trying to sweep me into a relationship without acknowledging its very real complications. This was a man being honest with me about exactly what a future together would require, giving me the choice with full knowledge of the risks involved. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Anything." "If I had never collapsed that night," I said slowly, "if you had never carried me to your bed, do you think we would still have found our way to each other eventually?" He considered the question seriously, his gaze thoughtful, as he looked out over the darkening grounds of the estate. "I do not know," he admitted. "I had noticed you before that night, more than I ever let myself acknowledge. The way you worked harder than anyone else in this house without ever complaining. The quiet dignity you carried, even when I know people underestimated you because of how you look. But I had convinced myself that a man like me did not deserve to want something as simple and pure as caring for someone the way I have come to care for you." "Simple and pure," I repeated softly, a small smile tugging at my lips, despite the seriousness of the conversation. "I don't think anything about loving a mafia boss counts as simple." He laughed then, a genuine, warm sound I had rarely heard from him, and something in my chest tightened with affection at the sight of him so unguarded, so entirely present in this moment with me. "Perhaps not simple," he agreed, "but pure nonetheless. Whatever chaos surrounds this life, what I feel for you, has never been complicated in the way it matters most. I reached for his hand then, lacing my fingers through his, the same way he had done that very first night, though this time, I was fully awake, fully aware, fully choosing this connection with open eyes instead of unconscious instinct. I am choosing this, I said firmly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. I am choosing you, and everything that comes with loving you. Not because I am naive about the danger, but because for the first time in my life, someone sees me completely, and does not find me lacking because of my size or my background, or anything else the world has tried to convince me makes me less worthy of happiness. His expression softened into something achingly tender, and he lifted our joined hands to press a gentle kiss against my knuckles. You have never been less than extraordinary, Nora. From the very first moment I saw you working yourself past exhaustion because you refused to let anyone down, I knew you carried a strength most people could only dream of possessing. We stood together on that balcony for a long while, watching the last light fade from the sky, neither of us in a hurry to fill the comfortable silence with unnecessary words. Eventually, he turned toward me, his expression growing serious once more, though this time there was no fear or hesitation behind it. I want you to stay, he said quietly. Not as staff, not as someone I employ to manage this household. I want you here as my partner, in every sense of the word, if you are willing to accept everything that comes with that choice. Tears welled in my eyes, though this time they came from a place of overwhelming happiness rather than fear or exhaustion. I want that too, I whispered. More than I have wanted anything in a very long time. He pulled me into his arms then, holding me close as the last light disappeared behind the horizon, and for the first time since I had arrived at this estate exhausted and desperate simply to survive another difficult day, I allowed myself to imagine a future built on something more than survival. A future built on genuine partnership, genuine respect, and a love I had never quite believed I would find, especially not in a place as dangerous and unpredictable as the world Damon Ricci called home. In the weeks that followed, my role within the household transformed entirely. I no longer scrubbed floors or organized files late into the night, though I insisted on maintaining some sense of purpose within the estate, eventually taking on responsibilities managing the household staff and overseeing the daily operations that kept everything running smoothly. Damon supported this decision fully, understanding that I needed purpose beyond simply being his partner, that my identity had never been built solely around romantic love, no matter how deeply I had come to feel it. My mother, once she learned the truth about the nature of Damon's business and the danger that had briefly touched my life, expressed understandable worry, though her concerns softened considerably once she witnessed firsthand how genuinely he cared for me, how carefully he had arranged for her continued medical care, without ever making her feel like a burden or an obligation. He looks at you the way your father should have looked at me, she told me quietly one afternoon, watching Damon across the room, as he patiently answered her questions about the security measures now protecting our small family. Like you are the most important thing in his entire world. I could not argue with her observation, because I saw the same thing every single day, in the way he made time for quiet conversations, despite the demands of running his empire, in the way he still occasionally found excuses to hold my hand, remembering, I think, exactly how our story had begun. Della, ever perceptive, noticed the shift immediately, teasing me gently about how differently I carried myself now, lighter, more confident, no longer shrinking into the background the way I had when I first arrived at the estate, exhausted and desperate to prove my worth through endless labor. You deserve this happiness, she told me one evening, helping me prepare for a quiet dinner Damon had arranged, the first real celebration either of us had allowed ourselves since the danger from the Calloway family had finally passed. Every bit of it. That evening, as I dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that made me feel confident and beautiful, rather than simply practical, I caught my reflection in the mirror and hardly recognized the woman staring back at me. Gone was the exhausted, overworked housekeeper, collapsing from sheer exhaustion in a cold hallway. In her place stood someone who had learned, through fear and danger and unexpected tenderness, exactly how much she deserved to be loved fully and completely, exactly as she was. When I made my way downstairs, Damon was waiting for me near the entrance to the dining room, his expression shifting into something soft and admiring the moment he saw me approaching. He crossed the distance between us and took my hand gently, the same gesture that had marked the beginning of everything between us, though now it carried none of the confusion or uncertainty from that very first night. "You take my breath away," he said quietly, sincerity evident in every word. "You saved my life," I said softly, "and somewhere along the way, you gave me back a version of myself I did not know I was allowed to want." He led me into the dining room, where a simple but elegant dinner awaited, candles casting warm light across the table, none of the usual formality or business associated with his position anywhere in sight. This was simply us, two people who had found each other in the most unexpected circumstances, choosing to build something real despite every reason the world might offer for why we should not. Later that night, long after dinner had ended and quiet conversation had drifted into comfortable silence, I found myself once again lying beside him, my hand resting naturally in his, no longer unconscious or uncertain, but deliberate and sure. "Do you remember what I said to you that very first night?" he murmured, his voice quiet in the darkness of the room, "when you finally opened your eyes and saw me holding your hand?" "You told me not to scare you like that again," I whispered, smiling softly at the memory. "I meant it as a warning then," he said, "but I think, even in that moment, some part of me already understood that I never wanted to let go of your hand again, no matter what fear it stirred inside me." I turned to face him fully, studying the sincerity etched across every line of his expression. A man who had once seemed so distant and unreachable, now completely open and vulnerable in front of me. "You never have to let go," I said softly. "Not now, not ever, if you do not want to." He pulled me closer, pressing a gentle kiss against my forehead, and I felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, a sense of peace settle deep into my bones, the kind of peace that comes only from finally finding exactly where you belong. Outside, the estate stood quiet under the night sky, its walls having witnessed violence and danger, fear and uncertainty, but also, now, something far more powerful than any of it. A love built not on convenience or circumstance, but on genuine understanding, on two people who had each carried heavy burdens alone for far too long, finally choosing to carry them together instead. I closed my eyes that night with my hand still held firmly in his, no longer uncertain about what the future might hold, no longer afraid of the danger that came with loving a man like Damon Ricci. Whatever challenges awaited us, I knew now, with absolute certainty, that we would face them exactly as we had faced everything since that very first night in the hallway. In the months that followed, our life together settled into something I never could have imagined during those exhausting early days of endless labor and quiet loneliness. Damon still carried the weight of his responsibilities, still disappeared into tense meetings and difficult decisions that came with running an empire built on power and fear, but he no longer carried that weight entirely alone, and neither, I found, did I. We built small rituals together, quiet mornings on the balcony before the demands of the day pulled us in separate directions, dinners we protected fiercely from interruption whenever possible, evenings spent simply existing in each other's company without the need for constant conversation to fill the silence. My mother's health remained stable under the care Damon had arranged, and slowly, cautiously, she began to trust the man who had once frightened her simply by reputation alone, coming to see him instead as someone who genuinely cherished her daughter. There were still difficult days, moments when the shadow of his world crept close enough to remind me that safety was never entirely guaranteed in a life like this. But I had learned, through fear and danger and unexpected tenderness, that certainty was never the point. What mattered was choosing, again and again, to face whatever came with someone who saw every part of me clearly and found nothing lacking. Some evenings, when the house grew quiet and the staff had long since retired for the night, I would think back to that very first moment, collapsing in the hallway, waking to find my hand wrapped around his. I used to wonder what might have happened if I had simply pulled away that morning, embarrassed and afraid, and never allowed myself to wonder what his gentleness that night might have meant. But I never regretted staying, never regretted letting curiosity and quiet hope guide me toward a truth I had spent my whole life believing was not meant for someone like me. Love, I had learned, did not care about the size of the body carrying it, or the humble beginnings a person came from, or the fear that told you happiness belonged to someone else. It simply arrived, quietly at first, in the warmth of a hand holding yours through the darkest hours, and it stayed, fiercely and completely, for those brave enough to hold on. Together, hand in hand, unwilling to ever let go again.